We try not to jump the staff too much if there's anything
Okay.
they might have to prep for.
Yeah,
But if there's something you wanted to add, just for us to start discussing, we could adjust here. Otherwise, if it's something that could be discussed at a future meeting, just throw that in at your reports at the end, say, hey, can we put this in somewhere?
I'll wait for that.
Okay, cool.
Thanks. Don't forget.
Anything else? All right, then our agenda is approved as presented, and we'll move on to approval of our minutes from the February 5th meeting. That will take motion second from people who were present at that meeting.
I motion to approve the minutes of the meeting.
Okay, motion by Monica. Is there a
I'll
second?
second.
Second from Chris, thank you. Are there any corrections needed to those minutes? Hearing none, all in favor of approving the minutes from February 5th as presented, say aye.
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 Any opposed, nay?
No.
That carries and those minutes are approved, thank you. That will bring us on to our public invitation portion of the meeting for any interested persons to address the commission. Do we have anyone registered this month?
We have no one registered.
Okay. Reminder, if you want to speak to us at some point, there's an email address listed on the agenda, for anyone watching at home. So then we'll go to what is our one business item of the day. Appointment of a vice chair. This is me to present, I guess. So do you want anything else with that? Or,
No.
okay. Our bylaws call for me to name a vice chair for the year. Purpose just being to fill this role of running the meeting if I am absent at any point for some reason. So we do have slipped in at the last meeting minute some things for you from Sandy with that language. And I'm proposing David Yates for this year to do that. So I guess then that might.
Motion.
Yeah, it's weirdly worded. Anyway, we'll do it as a motion. I'll just say I move that we approve David Yates as vice chair for the coming year.
I
So,
second the motion.
okay, got a second from Monica. I don't know if we actually need it. Is there any discussion? Okay, all in favor of that, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
No discussion? Okay.
Anyone opposed? No, okay. Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Yeah. Is subject to approval is kind of a weird word. Never mind, my brain's going down a different rabbit hole. So we'll start, we have several information items for the day. First, it's going to be about understanding Minnesota's changing climate, various observations, trends, and projections. We have Kenny Blumenfeld, who might remember me from
Tony,
15 years ago. Hi.
hey, good to see you.
Come on up, tell us about yourself.
Tony, or if I could just say,
Yeah.
we're really appreciative. Kenny has been going to the well day in and day out for the Regional Parks and Trail System. You presented at a lunch and learn that we held. You presented at the Parks and Trails Legacy Advisory Council that we help staff. And now you're here at the Metropolitan Parks and Open Space Commission. So we really appreciate your work and appreciate its context-setting power because I think it will really fold in nicely to our next item, which is all about our climate and natural systems work as we work to adapt our regional parks and trail system. So thanks, Kenny.
Well, wonderful. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here with this committee. Is this a committee?
Commission,
Commission.
same thing.
Commission.
No.
Yeah, so my name's Kenny Blumenfeld. I'm a climatologist with the Department of Natural Resources. I work for the state of Minnesota. And I do a lot of kind of what I'm doing today, just for different audiences, trying to help people understand what's happening with our climate, try to make sense of it, make sense of the trends, what we've observed, get a handle on some of the extremes. And this is gonna be similar to what I do, but maybe a little more focused on things that would affect recreation. I know the Met Council actually has lots of interests in the climate. So depending on which commission or committee I am speaking with, we might have a different focus. So this will be similar to information I shared back in January. So what we'll do today is, I could tell that this was made from a PDF because I used to have a really clever animation sequence that would go through here and the cat would show up last. But doesn't matter, we can tell the joke right up front too. 2025, we'll talk a little bit about what that year was like. Honestly, climatologically, it wasn't a spectacular year, although there were a couple of important events across the state. The second point, really, that we'll spend the most time on is that the trends you may have heard of in our climate in the last decade or so really continue. We continue getting warmer, we continue getting wetter, but there are ups and downs or variability that's imposed over that and might make it a little bit confusing for some folks. For example, we have been in a distinctly dry phase for the last 5 years or so, but that doesn't reverse the longer term trend towards getting wetter, and we'll take a look at that. The confused, kind of disappointed or grumpy looking cat is there because, well, as a state entity, we have the Microsoft 365 subscription, which includes, I don't know, it looks like thousands and thousands of stock photos, and I just try to give taxpayers some kind of return on their investment here and use stock photos that maybe match the mood of what we're presenting. And I think when you say things like the dry early 2020s show evidence of a continued wet trend, that might be a confusing statement. I'm going to try and make sense of that with some data. And similar to that fourth statement, on average, snowfall has been increasing. What that means is there's more snow falling, but there's less snow sticking around. So our average snow depth has been declining. And that is, that has ramifications for recreational purposes. People like using the trail system for skiing or going out state and snowmobiling, or even things like ice skating are affected by some of the changes we've observed in our climate. We don't have enough time to cover everything, but I think this will be a pretty data dense and intensive presentation. So let's just start with where we were as of the latter part of February globally. That red trace is the average temperature around the world. So basically every available location on Earth that either has a measurement or can be sensed remotely can estimate its temperature, and then you take an average. It's sort of a spatial global average. And it's being compared to, see, all those gray squiggles, that's what you call a spaghetti plot. And those are all the other years that we have on record, and we can't show them all on this page, but you're probably reading it correctly. That red line looks like it's primarily near the top of all the other squiggles. It's not at the top, but it's near the top. And that means that it's so far this year been one of the warmer years we have on record. We're only about 2 months in, but that would be an accurate portrayal of where we've been so far. The orange line is last year, 2025, which was consistently at or near the top, but not necessarily the very, very top for most of the year. Those two squiggles you see above it are actually 2023 and 2024. And so the point is beginning about 2.5 years ago, really, sometime June, July of 2023, we entered a phenomenally warm period where we just started breaking all kinds of global temperature records. Sometimes those conditions would be reflected here in Minnesota, but Minnesota is not the globe, and vice versa. And sometimes the conditions would not be reflected. So it kind of depends on what the mood of our local weather conditions were at the time, but it was globally astronomically warm. Pretty much the warmest that we've ever observed since we've got measurements, and potentially the warmest in a much longer period of time. You just have to use different types of data to validate that. A lot of climate scientists will say, well, you don't want to focus too much on just the air temperatures because all of the energy is actually stored in the oceans. And so if we fixate on air temperatures globally, we might be looking at the wrong thing. Heat energy is stored in the water of the oceans. The oceans are 2/3 of the Earth's surface, and they are much more effective and efficient at storing heat than the dry, kind of rigid land masses. But honestly, if you look at ocean temperatures, especially near the surface, it's a similar story. 2026 so far is not at the very top, and it would be interesting to see what happens when that graph gets updated next week, but has been near the top, meaning among the warmest years so far, but not the very warmest. You can see that by and large, 2025 was warmer than 2026. But those squiggles above 2025 are, again, 2023 and 2024. I know this because I've been following this for multiple years, and I know which, those 2 years were the top. It would be almost impossible to use the key and figure out which one was 2023 or 2024. But those two upwards most squiggles are the oceanic temperature traces across the year, going from January through December. In the last 2 years, two of the last 3 full years. So we've entered a very warm period globally in terms of air temperature and also in terms of ocean heat content, which then is reflected by the surface temperatures of the ocean. You might ask, well, what does any of this really have to do with Minnesota? And truly, you can't always make a direct link between what's happening globally and what's happening here. For example, you've heard about the way global temperatures have risen. Well, Minnesota's temperatures have risen faster. So we, here in Minnesota, are experiencing faster changes than the global average. Now this mind-boggling graph, I always start apologizing for it, and then I give you some assurance that when I'm done here, you'll understand it, I think. This is taking all of the years we have on record for Minnesota and taking an average temperature, so across the entire state for every day of each year. And this is using what's called a gridded data set. So you don't have to worry about interesting geographic or topographic differences. We're just taking the average of all of the points for Minnesota in that data set. And it's a pretty strong way of evaluating. You get one value. Obviously, here in southern Minnesota, the temperatures tend to be higher than the average for the state. And also we have a metropolitan area which has an urban heat island and gets an extra heating boost. So don't take the temperature values too literally for where you live. These are also annual averages. The other part of this axis, which is shown on the vertical, is total precipitation. And so you've got an average of the total precipitation for each year, and you've got an average of the temperature for each year, and then those are paired at a single point for each year. The way you interpret this is, we have not just plotted the raw temperature, but instead are plotting the difference between the raw temperature and the 20th century averages, and the same is true for precipitation. So if you see those arrows in the middle of the graph, the horizontal arrow is showing you where the kind of 20th century average precipitation was. Any dot that's above that gray arrow is a wet year relative to the 20th century, and any dot below it is a dry year. And then the same is true for that vertical double arrow line, which is telling us where the average temperature was on this graph. Any dot to the right is warm, and any dot to the left is cool. Those labeled dots in the upper right quadrant represent the combined warmest and wettest years on record. So they're not just warm and they're not just wet, but they're kind of the standout 10 years in terms of combined warmth and wetness. Everything in that upper right quadrant, so above the temperature average line and to the right of above the precipitation average line and to the right of the temperature average line, all of those are essentially combined warm and wet years compared to 20th century averages. It's just that those red labeled dots are the most extreme years. What I'd like you to notice is our record goes back to 1895. So we have 131 years of record. And each of those red labeled dots has occurred since 1998. So only in the last 28 years. So the top 10 combined warmest, wettest years on record all occurred within the last 28 years of a 131-year record. The chance of that happening at random is extraordinarily low. This is how we understand scientifically that there's something systemic or something systematic happening that's pushing us towards warmer and wetter conditions. It's not that every year currently is warm and wet. We have all kinds of ups and downs that are part of our climate. We go through dry periods and we go through cool periods even as we get warmer and wetter. You see in the upper, is this a
There's not a pointer.
There's not a pointer?
No, sorry.
Okay, so this just shuts everything down.
I think it might.
Okay, so if you see the labeled dot in the kind of just to the left in the very top of the graph, it says 2019 wettest.
Yeah.
That year is the wettest year on record, and again, this is a statewide average, so there would be parts of the state that maybe weren't extraordinarily wet, and then some parts that really were, but on average, it's the wettest year for the state of Minnesota. Note that it's to the left of the 20th century average temperature line, meaning it was a relatively cool year. So it's not that every year is warm and wet. In fact, if we look at some of the blue dots that aren't labeled on the far right side of that graph, they're a little bit below the line. Those are very warm years that were also dry. Some of those are recent drought years. So it's not that every single year is warm and wet. But what's interesting is the vast majority of those years in the last, say, 4 to 5 decades have been some combination of warm or wet. In fact, only one year, you gotta go back to 1987 to have a year, maybe it was 86. Anyway, you gotta go back 41 years to have a year that was cool and dry, and in that lower left quadrant. Everything else has been either warm or wet, or in some cases, many cases, both. So this is, in 2025, barely made the cut as a warm, wet year. It's much warmer than average. You can see it labeled there on the graph. But it's not much wetter than the long-term average. And this is, again, we're talking about the 20th century averages, which go from, I guess we're looking at 1900 to 1999. And so that period is a long reference period, and it's a little bit easy now for us to exceed averages from that time. But when you've heard of normals, climatological normals, which are based on the most recent, you okay there?
Yeah, I'll be okay.
All right. I do know CPR.
Yeah, better.
Okay, good. We have, climatological normals are these 30-year averages. The most recent one ended in 2020, so it's 1991 through 2020. Those averages get recomputed every 10 years. And those normals or averages have been, obviously, they've been showing signs of getting wetter and getting warmer. So 2025 was actually not as remarkably warm compared to the recent normal or averaging period of the last 30 years as it is compared to the entirety of the 20th century. And the same is true for wetness. It's a little bit above the line for precipitation when you compare it to 20th century averages, but actually would be drier than normal if we just look at the last 30-year average period. All right, enough of that. We can stop staring at that graph. Additional information about what we experienced. I mean, honestly, it wasn't a spectacular year. It was, I just said, you know, we were basically slightly wet compared to the 20th century, but actually below recent normals in terms of precipitation. And that's actually the 5th time in 6 years that we had, by recent standards, what would be considered to be a dry year. This is evidence of that kind of dry phase that we've been in. We've had a lot more drought. We've had more rain-free periods. The main events of the year, I think it's a subjective determination, but if you look at kind of what costs people the most hardship and money, there was two things. One, we had a destructive windstorm in the north near Bemidji with phenomenally strong winds, 106-mile-an-hour wind recorded at the airport. And then there was the frequent smoke outbreaks. We had more smoky days noted by the Pollution Control Agency last year than any year since they've been keeping record. And probably the smokiest weather in general in at least 50 years. We can't really push it back farther than that. And if you go back in our record far enough, everyone was burning coal and coughing like crazy and awful air quality. And it's very hard at that point to do an apples to apples comparison because we have different sources of pollution now. But in our lifetimes, this is clearly probably the smokiest year we've had. It didn't really, otherwise the weather wasn't all that remarkable. If you subtract those two things, it was kind of a slightly above average year in terms of temperature and a near, depending on how you look at it, either above or below average for precipitation. We didn't have any huge, in terms of aerial footprint, floods. We had some severe flooding in western Minnesota, but you expect that every year. We didn't have any remarkable drought. There were no historic blizzards. The tornadoes were not particularly frequent or intense. We're lucky. So it was an unremarkable year climatologically, even though every year is kind of exciting, especially in my line of work. So that's probably all we need to say about last year, other than I just want to point out with the graph here, and this is, I know, lots of dots on the graph. This is the average, so now we're just looking at precipitation, averaged around the state for each year back to 1895. And the reason you've got two different colored dots is they're really like two different eras. The first era, from 1895 right through 1969, is what we think of as kind of normal climate conditions. I mean, we had a wet period at the beginning, and then it got very dry during the Dust Bowl era, and we had some extraordinary drought and even some nasty heat waves. And then after about 20 years of pretty dry conditions, we recovered to sort of a normal state, and then had a couple pretty wet years in the 1960s, but it's really since that time that we've seen this kind of systematic increase in our precipitation. Now, I want you to notice there's a slightly slanted line there. That's what's called a trend line. It's based on linear regression. It's very simple geometry. And it's not perfect. It's the best way to take kind of a messy data set and say, well, okay, here's the average increase. For precipitation, this increase is barely what you would consider to be statistically significant. And if we have one or two more really dry years, we probably can't show trend lines because they'll start failing tests of significance. But it's still on average a positive, in other words, an increasing trend for precipitation. You see all that scatter of the dots around that line, that just tells you that any given year is actually not that likely to fall near that line, meaning the line itself isn't a good predictor of where any given year is going, but it's been a good predictor of the general trend. And what I want you to notice is that very highest dot, that's 2019. It's, on your screen, it's a little bit in from the far right side. That was a year where we had huge rainfall quantities, especially in southern and central Minnesota. And we'd never seen rain and even snow really like that in some areas. And then look at the very next year. It was like we fell off of a cliff. Just a huge drop down to 2020 and then 2021, which is the driest of the most recent, I guess that would be 6 years now. Of those 6 years, only one was above that trend line, and that was 2024 when we had a lot of flooding in northeastern and south central and southwestern Minnesota. Some of it was kind of iconic flooding that made national news, but really 5 of those 6 recent years are below that trend line, and they're a huge departure from where we were. Now, if you look at the line that I've drawn from the lowest of those 6 values, it's a red line that extends leftward across the graph. That is the precipitation value on average in the year 2021, which was the driest of these dry, 5 or 6 years. And the reason I draw that is to kind of put this in perspective. All right, so on one hand, we fell off of a precipitation cliff and plunged into drought-prone conditions, and it was a big change. And on the other hand, all of the dots that you see below that line are years that were drier than 2021. So in a recent context, this is a very dry period. We hadn't seen anything like it in quite a while. But in a historical context, it is truly an unremarkable period. I think 2021 is the 29th driest year on record. That gets into kind of like who cares territory for drought and for dryness. We don't generally make a big deal out of things that are, in the upper quarter only of some distribution. We're looking at extremes to really get our attention. And if you look at also the pattern of dry years prior, you can actually see that dry years are on average getting wetter. And in fact, if you remember that confused cat, the dry years are getting wetter. And we're really in probably the wettest dry period we've ever observed in Minnesota. So it's been a dry period, but as dry periods go, we've had more precipitation than all the others. And you can just look at all the different downward spikes on that graph and see that the vast majority of them are below even the lowest year during the most recent 5-6 year dry period. So just a little perspective there. And this is how we can say we continue to see signs of a trend towards wetter conditions, even through the dry period that we've been experiencing. Now, I don't know if I'll be able to say that in 4 years. If we have 4 more dry years, that's going to make a dent on. But as of now, we still have a trend towards increasing precipitation, and we are still seeing our dry years kind of being wetter or outperforming or out-precipitating other dry years historically. All right, so that's kind of a recent summary, and now we're going to actually, and it ties into the trends we're going to discuss. But before we talk about trends, I'd like to remind people of where we are. We're in Minnesota, where we have an extreme climate. We have a lot of variability, and we have a lot of weather hazards. And because people are so interested in what's happening with extremes and what's happening with specific types of hazards, sometimes we have to back off and remind folks that not everything that we have is that we experience in a year is that unusual in the context of Minnesota's climate. For example, the windstorm in Bemidji last year, it was catastrophic. It was definitely one of the biggest windstorms we've had in the last several decades to hit a populated area. And that said, these are things that are absolutely part of our climate. We have records of giant blowdowns across Minnesota's forests going back well over 100 years. Some of them have been reconstructed using tree ring analysis or dendroecological techniques, dendroclimatological techniques. And we also know from observations that, they're not, that these derechos and massive windstorms are kind of a recurrent creature. You never know exactly where they're going to hit. You never know exactly when the big one is going to hit. And they seem to, on average, slip into our news feed every 5 to 10 years. And the ones you don't hear as much about are the ones that only hit forests. The ones you hear a lot about are the ones that strand hundreds of people in the boundary waters or, demolish a well-known town in northern Minnesota. We have tornadoes. We have blizzards. We get drought, we get heat waves, we get cold air outbreaks, we get floods. We have a lot. This is a lot more than if we had this presentation for the equivalent of the Met Council in San Diego. It would be boring. I'd say sometimes there are clouds. And, and the temperature can range anywhere from 60 to 92. In Minnesota, it's common for temperatures to go from well below zero up to around 100 degrees. So 100, 120 degree temperature range in parts of the state is not that unusual. 140 degrees in parts of western Minnesota. So when we talk about our extreme climate, it's that. There's a big difference between our winter and our summer. Summer gets 4 times more precipitation than winter. So there's a wet-dry difference also. And then we have a lot of hazards, and we also know, right, I mean, 3 years ago, I would have come in here and you all would have been concerned, is Minnesota ever gonna be able to handle the amount of snow that we're getting? Because it was crushing everything, and we were having power outages, and trees were being bent down to the ground. And people on snowmobile trails in northern Minnesota were going to the hospital because they were running over buried trees. What? I mean, that's not a problem we're having this year. But the question changes as our weather conditions change, and we know here that you get a big snowy winter one year, and it's not guaranteed the next year. We know that we get a lot of tornadoes one year, that's not guaranteed the next year. We know that if we have drought, we could have flooding very quickly after that. So this is what's illustrated in this first slide and by this concept. We have a lot of variability, which is that year-to-year lack of predictability from one season to the next or from one summer to the next summer. We have a lot of hazards, which is those pictures. And then we also have a naturally extreme climate, which are just kind of the depths of winter versus the depths of summer that we experience. And at the same time, so that's one piece of really important information when you want to know what's happening with our climate. At the same time, global temperatures are increasing in a manner that we've never really observed before. That began around 1970. It goes back, obviously, the processes that started it go back to the Industrial Revolution, but we didn't really start being able to detect it well until about 5-6 decades ago. And since then, we've been on an escalator ride to higher and higher temperatures, and these are global temperatures. And the important piece with this is that when you increase global temperatures, two things happen. One is typical place has more potential access or more availability at least of that heat, right? But not everyone gets the same amount uniformly. But also, whenever the air temperature increases, so does the rate of evaporation. And if you increase the rate of evaporation, that means you're moving water from the liquid form into the gas form. So as temperatures rise, we pull more water off the surface of the oceans and put it into the air. When that water resides in the air, it's water vapor, the gas form of water, but you also know it as humidity. And humidity is the fuel for precipitation, and it also can make a hot day feel a lot hotter. So what this has meant for Minnesota, I see that we have label-less maps. So this is the folly of sending a PDF, I guess. But I can tell you what's on them. That's great though. And there's also some really neat things have happened in the captions. Look at that. Un August eyes. That's the right map I'm looking at. That's cool though. I can resend this to you if you'd like. But in any case, Minnesota's gotten warmer, it's gotten more humid, and it's gotten wetter. I mean, again, you have to remember the variations or the ups and downs that are part of our climate. What the map is showing you on the left, I've seen this enough time, I made these maps. They're really cartographically grotesque specimens, but I know what they're doing. The map on the left is the change in the annual average temperature since 1895, the total change accumulated over Minnesota in 3 different zones. It averages about 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit, but it's higher in northern Minnesota. It's more like 3.8 degrees, 3.9 degrees, and it's lower in southern Minnesota, where it's more like 2.2, 2.3 degrees. In that middle map, we're looking at changes in winter temperature. Winter's gotten much warmer, much faster than the other seasons, and it's especially true at night. In northern Minnesota, winter temperatures, so that's December, January, February, on average, are almost 8 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than they were at the turn of the 20th century. In southern Minnesota, it's more like 5.5 degrees. So our winter nights are where we're seeing the most warming, and the map on the right is summertime days, and it actually, again, if we had labels, there would be a slight cooling in southern Minnesota, meaning high temperatures during summer have declined slightly, although that's not significant statistically. And in central Minnesota, the temperatures during the summertime days have increased by about 1 degree Fahrenheit, and it's more like 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit in northern Minnesota. So we see slight warming of summertime days in this region and in the north, but a much stronger warming of wintertime nights across the state, and especially in northern Minnesota. And our precipitation is increasing, and it's not just average annual, it's the wettest station in the state is getting wetter, which is what you're seeing on this graph. I did not show a graph indicating how our dew point temperatures, which is a measure of humidity, have risen on the most humid days of the year, but basically you pair that with that map on the right that shows, well, our summers are not really getting that much hotter in terms of air temperature, but they are getting more humid. And that means that there's more fuel for precipitation when we get most of our precipitation. So that's important. And it also means our hot days are going to feel hotter just because of the humidity, even if that's not reflected in the air temperature. One way of looking at some of our changes is, well, our winters don't get as cold as they used to. This is one of the best stations in Minnesota. It has no urban heat island. It's out almost the exact same latitude as the Twin Cities, straight west of here, far western Minnesota. It's pronounced not Milan, but Milan. That's how we do it in Minnesota. Don't go to Milan talking about Milan. You're gonna get run out of town. But this is a graph of the coldest day of the year. And just note that, you know, what looks like extremely cold conditions now, look at the most recent dips at the bottom of the right side of the graph. Those are what would now be considered extremely cold. And if you look to the left, those used to be fairly common values. What used to be kind of considered extreme no longer occurs. And this is true across Minnesota. It's especially true in the Twin Cities, where the warming of the climate is being augmented or added to by our urban areas here in, you know, especially Minneapolis, St. Paul, and inside our kind of beltway of 494, 694, where we have a very strong heat island. These effects are even stronger. In International Falls, which is the icebox of the nation, a typical January night, so it's the coldest month of the year, so the coldest nights of the coldest month of the year are almost 11 degrees, or more than 10.5 degrees warmer than they were just 7 decades ago. Again, that's on average, and you can see lots of spread. You still have cold years, but on average, our cold years are getting warmer. You see that even here. Our cold Januaries are getting warmer, and our warm Januaries are getting warmer. If we look at the way summer is changing in terms of temperatures, well, that graph is kind of doing the same thing the winter graph a couple slides back was doing, looking at the highest temperatures of summer. And you see as you go from left to right, I mean, there's no sign that we're sort of leaving the historical range. I'm just gonna go back and show you, here we really are. We're having warmth in winter and at night that is unlike anything we had experienced historically. Or January low temperatures are now as warm as they've ever been with increasing frequency. Whereas our summertime high temperatures, we can't say that. We can't say, oh, we're having the highest high temperatures that we've ever had. We have not left the range. The maps show kind of the historical distribution of 90-degree days on the left, and the right map is actually a climate projection showing what is sort of expected by climate models in the next 20 to 40 years. And that's a big difference, a lot more 90-degree days. And what we think is actually happening, and here's the graph of dew point, is that the climate models they're maybe overestimating the actual air temperature, but they're doing it because they're really accounting for how much extra moisture is in the air, because when you add the effects of humidity, we're already seeing some of the highest heat index values and with high frequency that we have on record. And so when you just look at air temperature, it looks like we're not getting hotter yet. When you factor in humidity or dew point and then turn that into a heat index, which is what this horrible graph is doing, the heat index is now occasionally and with increasing frequency as high as we've ever measured. So the black line is just like this late afternoon, early evening highest air temperature of summer in the Twin Cities. The blue line at the bottom is the highest dew point or moisture reading basically at that same time of day, the highest one for each summer. And then that red line is when you combine those two and calculate a heat index. And we're starting to leave the historical distribution. So our humid heat is becoming more intense. Those who like nature, this is, our summers are getting longer, even though they're not necessarily having higher temperatures in the daytime. But we've been pushing back our peak of fall colors by almost 2 weeks now. And we just tied our record for latest peak fall colors in the Twin Cities this past October. We basically added 13 days later. So if back in the 1970s, you would expect peak colors to be in the first week of October, and now it's between the second and third week of October. We've shortened our freeze season. The first freeze of fall comes later by, basically 1.5 weeks on average. And then the final freeze of spring is coming 2 weeks earlier. So most places have lost 3 weeks of their freezing season. And in between, in that freezing season, you're also having more thaws. We already did this graph, so I can skip that. The most extreme precipitation is tending to be more extreme. Obviously, the last 6 years have kind of rebalanced that trend line a little bit because the precipitation during drought just isn't generally as abundant or extreme as it is. But even with the dry conditions of the recent 6 years, we still have an overall increase in the wettest day of the year anywhere in the state. That's pretty dramatic because water is something that's hard to manage when you have a lot of it falling. And the observations and projections kind of line up too. We've observed an increase in the frequency of rare rainfall events where you get, say, 4 inches in a day, and that increase is projected to continue. Basically, the increases we've already observed, the most moderate and modest projection is that those changes will come again. We'll get more precipitation and more heavy precipitation such that in 30, 40 years we'll have maybe 50 to 75% more higher frequency of these kind of heavy and extreme rainfall events. And this is just to put you all at ease if you hate maps and graphs. The image on the left is what warm winter looks like. This is a snowless winter, and the image on the right is what abundant precipitation can look like. Obviously, these are extreme versions of both, but we've also their recent experiences. That's the lost winter of 2 years ago on the left. We took about 20 pictures like that on 20 different days where we had bright sunshine, warm conditions, no snow on the ground. It was the heart of winter. And then that's a flooding scene from Gooseberry Falls in northeast Minnesota. Obviously, if we're on average getting wetter, that means we're on average not getting drier and in fact getting less dry. And so as a result, our drought frequency, this is actually a pretty potent graphic. It shows you a lot. This shows you the combined aerial coverage, intensity, duration, and frequency of drought. And so how high it is how much of the area is covered by drought, how wide each color section is basically a drought duration. Each of the spikes tells you about the frequency, and then the colors correspond to the severity or intensity. All of them show long-term declines. Now this is going to get complicated because as we continue warming, it's going to be easier to get into drought conditions from what used to be just kind of a normal dry spell. And so we can't project this to continue. We just know that right now, on average, we're getting more precipitation than we used to, even when it's dry. And as a result, all of our drought metrics seem to be going down. This is all to say drought's not yet becoming more severe in Minnesota. In terms of severe weather, this is an interesting thing we've never had to think about before. And the animation doesn't work here, but this had been a radar loop of a tornado outbreak in southeastern Minnesota. So image on the left happened right here. We had 10 to 20 inches on December 10th and 11th of 2021. 10 to 20 inches of snow across the central metro. It's a huge snowstorm. It's a good one. 5 days later, there was a tornado outbreak. We'd never had tornadoes in December. We'd never had tornadoes after November 15th in Minnesota that we knew of. And having 20 tornadoes, all of them occurring at night, along with an outbreak of severe thunderstorms, 5 days after a heavy snowfall. Well, that's a new trick that we didn't really know about, or we hadn't considered. And it caused a lot of problems, as you could imagine, because it was December. So the tornadoes were knocking out power, the severe thunderstorms were knocking out power. The weather system that caused them actually was producing a blizzard in northern Minnesota, which was knocking out power. And the weather system causing both the blizzard and the severe weather was powerful enough that even after those things cleared out, regional winds came in and knocked over the few remaining power lines in western and central Minnesota that hadn't already gone out. So we had power go out for really 3 or 4 different reasons on the exact same day. That we can't say that that's going to become commonplace, but it's happened now. We've been put on notice this could happen more. I've got a whole bunch of other graphs that I don't think we have time for because I want to get to your questions, but I want to put them in a nutshell for you. The same things we've observed with temperature and precipitation generally are happening in the winter. And so here, I'm just going to fly you through these. Duluth and the Twin Cities and Rochester and any station we can look at, Milan, they've all gotten more seasonal snowfall. So that's just a general increase with ups and downs, but a general increase in snowfall, including the most recent dry winters. All stations have seen a general increase in days where the snowplows have to come out, where you have what's called heavy snow. 4 inches or more, plows are out, school might even be canceled depending on your vulnerability, susceptibility, and exposure. But at the same time, across the state, that red line shows that during our snowfall season, our temperatures are increasing pretty dramatically. And we've also had more days where it rains in the winter. I'm showing Duluth. Every part of the state looks the same, maybe with different numbers. Kind of almost stair-step increase. It rains more in the winter than we've ever recorded. So we get more snow, we have higher temperatures, we get more heavy snow, we get more wintertime rain. We now get more damage from the snow because it has higher water content, or it falls and then rain falls on the snow and crushes the things that are underneath it. So no surprise, we have a harder time keeping snow on the ground. This is the average snow depth during winter is declined by about 25% across much of Minnesota. So even in northeastern Minnesota, where they're accustomed to much more snow, they've seen these same types of losses. Some parts of Minnesota that were kind of marginal for seasonal snow cover in the far south, they now spend much more of the winter without snow on the ground, pretty typically, than they do with snow on the ground. Even this winter in southwest Minnesota. So I'm going to leave it there. We can just kind of finish with what this has all meant for some of our winter recreation. Ideal winters would be what I would consider ones that have a nice amount of cold. You can freeze ponds and ice rinks, and you're going to have snow, but not too much snow. And you're going to have a lot of good, safe, usable days. There's nothing super dangerous happening. These are winters that are becoming less common. Then you have extreme winters. And they could be defined as winters that are either excessively snowy or excessively cold, and sometimes both. These are kind of like 3 years ago, almost too good. You get too much of a good thing. You get so much snow that the Northeast Minnesota Trail Network was shut down for a period of a week or more because they couldn't get their grooming equipment on it. And there are all these stories of wolves running across the trails, and they were using them to track deer, but those were the only species using the trails for a while. And those extreme winters, especially So when you look at cold, obviously, we're getting fewer of the extreme cold winters. But the heavy snow winters that are extreme in that regard are becoming more common. And then you have the winterless winters, where you have a lack of consistent snow cover and or abnormally high temperatures. And those are becoming more common too. And this is so fewer ideal winters, more extreme winters in terms of snowfall, and also more non-winters in terms of whatever you want to look at. So that's it. Thank you, everybody. Again, just to recap, we're getting warmer, we have more precipitation on average, we have heavier snows. We have ups and downs that are fundamentally part of our climate and will continue. But all the projections indicate we're gonna keep getting more precipitation, we're gonna have more humid heat, we're gonna have higher temperatures. It's hard to know where snowfall is going with all of this because our winters are shrinking at the same time that all of this is happening. So our opportunities for snow are gonna eventually decrease to the point that you can't get enough big snowstorms to keep up. But we don't know exactly when we cross that threshold. There's no evidence that we've done it yet. We didn't really talk about wildfire and degraded air quality other than the context of this year. These are kind of newer, more emerging hazards that we don't have a long history of dealing with it recently. And our winter conditions are becoming more variable and less dependent. So, thank you, everybody. I appreciate your patience. I apologize for any formatting difficulties. The maps in particular with, anyone going back to review this, like, well, that's interesting. What's that? What do those maps say?
If you send us a new one, we'll get it out to the commission.
Okay, well, thank you. So, questions initially? I hope you guys have some because I have like 8, so. David?
Yeah, I mean, thank you for this kind of grounding in all things weather. I guess I'd confirm some things that I think we've probably all heard, but much more engrossing, and I don't think the charts were that bad. I mean, once you went through them, they were pretty good. But towards the end, in like what the implications are for in the parks industry and for just general population enjoyment of the outdoors, it seems like there's some things that maybe are just gonna be either more or less dependent. So I don't know, does that mean more mosquitoes, so we're gonna need more protection or whatever, that there's more prevalence of the skin-borne illness? The recreation part of it, may mean it would just have to have maybe a different mindset. I don't know, that's if we're gonna have less ideal winters and the ones we do have are more extreme and nasty or just not a winter, the winter wonderland that we like to think of Minnesota is maybe that's more of a memory and we just have to make do somehow. Or maybe we get into the business of, our discussion prior of taking machines that make snow and doing some kind of artificial work rather than relying on the sky for it. So I don't really have a question. I just my mind's just spinning with all kinds of thoughts on what this means for kind of where we go from here.
Anything before you have to leave?
Yes, I have a question. Well, I have several, but I don't have. So you mentioned when you measure the cold days, and you add the humidity on the hot days. The hot days will become hotter, which makes sense. Have you tried added the humidity in the cold days too? Because I feel that this winter and last winter were way colder than the last before, and I think it's because they feel humid too. So I don't know.
So that's a great question. Certainly really humid air when it's cold would tend to make you feel colder, but when it's really cold,
It's just cold.
it's very dry.
I would
But it was windy, and I want to validate you that this, on average, is going to turn out to be, it was a warm winter. But That's because February was warm,
See, what you
but
present,
January was cold. And
yes,
December was cold, and we had some truly cold conditions in January. It just wasn't as cold as it used to be, but they're cold in a recent context, for sure.
I just keep hearing how it's, getting warmer and humid, and you promised me Florida weather here and it's not.
Oh, yeah, I'm not promising you Florida weather
No,
here.
I understand, my biggest conflict with this is I was born in Mexico City in the 80s and pollution was horrible. So I grew up learning all of this by memory, stuck in my mind as a preschooler. But when you tell me that it's getting weather, to me it's great. There is no lack of water. That's an improvement, which I understand, heat implies other things. So to today, I moved to Minnesota in 2006. There is no winter mountain line in Minnesota. It's a tough winter, no matter what you told me. So I don't know. I think it's important to see where it's going, but I also think 30 years or 40 years of information has to be a very short term in the terms of the planet that you measure. So our lifespan as humans is not as long as we know. And to that, how accurate is the measurements from the beginning of the 20th century to the 1970s, 1980s? Because I don't understand, our technology is way better now. So you can tell me exactly the humidity, the weather, everything, and I believe it, but how it was in 1915 or, 1920. So, I don't know.
That's a very good question. I'll just address the one about the equipment.
Yes.
So precipitation, the best way to measure precipitation is in a cylinder
Mhm.
with a graduated cylinder inside of it.
Okay.
Or a ruler that's graduated. And this is how precipitation has been measured for over 100 years. So the technology is not improved.
And we still use the same?
The best precipitation measurements are made by people who just have a cylinder
Okay.
and they collect the water in the cylinder and then they measure it. And because our eyes haven't changed very much, it's the same. There are automated ways
Mm-hmm.
to estimate how much precipitation has fallen, and that is more convenient. And it offers some advantages, but it's not better
Okay.
because you actually can miss some of that precipitation and you're making guesses, whereas precipitation in a cylinder is what we call a direct measurement. We know exactly how much is in there when we measure it. And the error is only whether or not you read it to the correct mark, and it's very small. Now, in terms of temperature, it's kind of the same. The technology for measuring temperature used to be what was called liquid in glass. You would put alcohol in a tube, and it would expand or contract depending on the temperature, and you would calibrate that, and then you would know based on how much it contracted, how cold it was, or how much it expanded, how warm it was. Then they started doing that with mercury, which does it in many cases better, but it's a very dangerous compound, so we got away from that. But it's always been, until very recently, where we've developed some digital methods for doing that, but those aren't necessarily improvements. Those are just using electrical resistance, a different way of doing the same thing.
Okay.
So both temperature and precipitation have been very accurate, with similar accuracy going back 130, 150 years in the United States anyway.
But no, I mean,
Yeah.
that actually put my mind at peace because I prefer to believe that it has always been the same human eye measure it, that we have, intervention of high level technology suddenly and then, well, yeah, everything's
I
gonna be
suppose
different.
one change that's worth mentioning is while the accuracy of the measurements is about the same, the number of them has been increasing because population has been increasing, so there's more people in more parts of the state to take them. And actually, a lot of these measurements are taken by volunteers, and you could be one if you want. It's
Correct.
called Cocoraz.
Yeah, there is a volunteer network for precipitation.
You have to be
That's a
willing to
good
go out and check your rain gauge at 7 a.m. every day.
And
That
one of the,
worries me.
And one of the things we have to be careful about in my line of work is, so for something like temperature, if you have a bunch of new measurements, it doesn't make a huge difference because temperature is pretty stable from one place to the next. But if you think about the way storms work, it's easy for them to fit between locations. And so as you add more precipitation observers, more observers in CoCoRaHS, the chance that you get a heavier rainfall than you would have measured previously starts to increase. That's why on this graph here, I know it's kind of confusing, but I am only using the same 58 stations for the entire period there, that's on the graph.
Oh.
Because then we don't have to worry about making it more likely to get bigger values as we get more observers on the right side of that graph. And by the way, it's only very, very recently that it's only in the last 10 years that we've even come close to topping the number of observers that we used to have. We used to have more. Then we lost a bunch because people don't like volunteering anymore, and now they're starting to make a big comeback. So, good question, thank you.
Thank you.
I don't wanna hold anyone up, but if you have
Thanks,
other
Ken.
questions.
You can tell me when we need to move on to something, otherwise I have.
We
things to
should
ask.
wrap by 5:10.
Okay. So one of the things I was wondering about, we know we have a little metro heat island that's a little bit different than the other stuff. Is the rate of change for our scope in the 7-county metro significantly different than the rest of that central band of Minnesota?
That's a good question. So generally, no. So I'll just kind of reframe the question maybe. We have ongoing warming of an average of 3 to 3.4 degrees or so right here in the Twin Cities and in central Minnesota. That's the total warming that we've accumulated over the last 130 years. Our urban heat island makes it so that we are, on any given day or night, warmer than areas around us. Most of the time. The only exception is when it's windy. So on January 23rd, when it was super cold, Twin Cities had the same temperature as Afton and pretty close to the same temperature as Waconia because it was also really obnoxiously windy. And so the urban heat island was just kind of dispersed. But in general, our rates of warming here in the Twin Cities are pretty similar because the urbanization isn't really expanding at a faster rate now than it was previously. And in fact, now as as new communities develop, they often have lighter rooftops, they have more vegetation, they're thinking about wetlands. And so our expansion of our urban and suburban areas has been done in a manner recently that offsets the way that would sort of augment some of the additional heat. So the warming trends in the Twin Cities are actually similar to what you see at the same latitude elsewhere. It's just that we have higher temperatures. So that's pretty much what we've observed. Now we haven't looked at it comprehensively, every possible scenario, but on some hot days, here in St. Paul, in downtown St. Paul, as you get into early evening, when most of the heat is going to continue to be retained by the buildings and the pavement, you might have a 10-degree boost over, 8-10 degree boost over areas 30 miles outside that you'll see have vegetation that cools down quickly. So it's a dramatic difference, but overall it averages out to be a few degrees warmer.
Okay.
Good question, Tony.
But yeah, in terms of the spread just within the metro, I'm out in Matamidi. So it's the east side of the White Bear Lake, the actual lake, and it is less densely developed than in the city of White Bear Lake. And also being on the east side of the lake with prevailing winds going across the water and a little bit more shade.
Yep.
It routinely can measure like 2 to 4 degree difference
Sure.
in Matamidi versus White Bear Lake, just like in my car thermometer driving around.
Yeah.
And 5 to 10 different between there and the airport. It's wild.
Yeah, that is, you can see some dramatic differences. And I think it was Hennepin County, right, they recently produced a summary of people doing that, driving around with sensors. And so they made this nice map of what sort of the heat distribution looks like at different times of day in different scenarios. It's pretty neat. So if I think of it, I can send that to you all.
The council did something a few years ago, looking specifically at tree covered greenery and that impact on temperature, and building that into some of our equity analysis. Because obviously the urban core is more impacted by that than, you know, further out, like where I am, and then that has different population segments in it too.
Yeah.
Something that, some of this is climate data and some of it's not. I'm wondering if we have a way of tracking like enjoyable recreation days, how many of the 365 are ones you would want to be outside? So it's a combination of, is there extreme heat, is there extreme cold, is there extreme wind, what's the humidity like, is it raining, is there wildfire smoke, which we had a bunch of, lightning, anything like that. Do we have a way of tracking that? Because I feel like your data tracks a lot of those, but I'm guessing not all. Like we noticed it, we have a visitor count annually that we look at, and we had to have it mentioned of this one is lower here because of the wildfire smoke. It showed up in our data already. Do we have a way of tracking that?
We could, I mean, that's a really good point. So we kind of as a joke, maybe 10 years ago, I developed this thing called the Summer Glory Index. And it was basically, if the high temperature is not 90 degrees or higher, and the air and the low temperature is less than 70 degrees, and there's effectively no precipitation, and the humidity is at a reasonable threshold that I define, then these days are, you know, not disqualifyingly awful.
Yeah.
And there's a point system, and we've had some really spectacular summers recently. I mean, the drought summers that were not smoky were often, you know, like, at least for DNR, blockbuster recreation, because, you know, as long as you weren't in fire burning restrictions, people were camping, they were out using the trails. But what happened this year was many of our good days, so, you know, the days where it's like really warm and humid, and you're waiting for something to break, and then the thunderstorm comes through, and then it gets kind of cool. Those days happen because the winds turn around from the northwest and blow in refreshing Canadian air. And this year, 2025, whenever the air was blowing from the northwest, it was coming from an area that was burning. And so every time it would be warm and humid, and that would break, and then we would get a mouthful of smoke, and we got no relief. And when you look at it that way, it was either warm and humid or rainy or smoky the majority of the summer. I mean, it was really, there weren't very many days that were just, that's perfect. So we could look at it by adding some of the smoke categories to the existing Summer Glory Index and, you know, make something a little more serious too. It's possible. We have data now.
Yeah,
So it's a good idea.
and this is not a question we can answer now because it's, I'm sure, too much, but otherwise something to think about for your office in terms of useful data. A lot of what we and our implementing agency partners are looking at is related to capital investment in stuff related to certain kinds of activities. So things that we can look at that tell us whether there's going to be significant shifts in actual activities and how we have to plan for them in stuff where we're going to build something that has a 10 to 40 year lifespan. Like mentioning the possibility of increased artificial snow production is what the main thing that's come up so far. But also, is there anything else that it's going to impact? I don't know of any other categories offhand. I guess the one other I thought of is potentially anything related to ice fishing, but we don't have a lot of infrastructure for that. But like, is there gonna be a change in stop building that, start building this, maybe lay things out differently because of anything? Cause that's all Oracle see into the future things where we're spending money now, but we want it to still be useful for its
Yeah.
lifespan.
I'll kind of answer as in backing away to yield to the rest of your meeting, but I think one way of, so I'm trying to help people think as reflexively as possible about the climate. And to kind of do, and to kind of chicken out from any real predictions, to say that increasingly, all the things that you could ever expect are going to be on the table, increasingly. Something that we observed this year in parts of Minnesota was like what you could essentially call a summer heat wave, 20 days later than had ever been observed. So it would happen in September and October, where we had in western Minnesota, out in Milan, a run of 15 days or 14 days or 17 days, I don't remember the exact number, where the high temperature was 85 degrees or higher every single day. And that had never happened that late in the year. And it opened up beaches. People were swimming again. I went swimming. You know, I jumped in Phelan. I don't know if that's advisable, but but people were swimming. And so starting to think, okay, summer will creep into fall. We've already seen it. We've had the Twin Cities Marathon hit hard twice, almost again this year. They ran it this year?
Yeah.
Barely. It was 91 degrees. They barely made it. Yeah. 2 years ago they had to cancel it because it was too humid and hot. And that kind of thing, thinking about, all right, well, when do we time certain events? You know, if something is really sensitive to heat, I would start pushing that event into the margins, deeper into fall, or move it earlier into spring. Where you might end up having to cancel because of a snowstorm at times. But thinking kind of reflexively and understanding, but the biggest ones are, you know, you already named them. How do you replace snow?
Well, that reminds me of one other thing that I have actually heard of people like approaching me and asking about is, thank you, whether bathrooms are open and water is turned on in campgrounds and stuff, because we've traditionally done Memorial Day to Labor Day, and people both before and after are like, why is the water shut off?
Yeah, I mean, I'm one of those people. We're out here, out on a hot bike ride, and you need some water, and who cares that it's May 3rd?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
or April 23rd or whatever, so thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Also, you have my email address. Anybody can follow up with me directly. You don't need to contact our outreach communications office or anything. So if you have any further questions or you need any additional information, I work for all of you. I'm a state of Minnesota employee, so you own me. Thanks.
Thank you. All right. So that then brings us on to talking about climate and natural systems in the context of the council specifically. A work group update, go ahead, Evan and Paul.
All right, well, good afternoon, Mr. Chair and Commissioners. I am Colin Kelly, and today Kevin Fan and I will be sharing an update with you on the Regional Park Implementing Agency, Met Council Climate and Natural Systems Work Group. Over the next 3 or 4 minutes or so, I'll be providing you with some introductory information, including the purpose and background of this work group, as well as illuminating the policy connections between the work group, Imagine 2050, and our Regional Parks and Trails Policy Plan. After that, I'll pass it over to Kevin to share work group priorities and some background on the exploration of an open space subclassification. The Climate and Natural Systems Work Group convenes Regional Park Implementing Agency natural resource managers to identify and coordinate regional level opportunities for natural systems protection and restoration. A key question we're asking ourselves, and hoping you'll contemplate as well, is where can the council support these efforts with our regional park implementing agencies? As you'll see in the next two slides, this work is directly connected to adopted goals, objectives, policies, and actions in Imagine 2050 and the Regional Parks and Trails Policy Plan. This work group was created during the update to the Parks Policy Plan and informed the content in both the natural systems and climate resilience policy areas. Fortunately, our implementing agency partners saw the value in this work and were willing to continue meeting as a work group to implement related work plan items. Just over a year ago, after a fairly lengthy planning process, the Council adopted the Imagine 2050 Regional Development Guide, including the Regional Parks and Trails Policy Plan. Two of the cross-cutting regional goals are directly connected to this work group, including we lead on addressing climate change and we protect and restore natural systems. These regional goals informed a set of 5 new parks and trails objectives that connect to new and existing policies and actions. 2 of those objectives are also directly connected to this work group, including protect and restore, and adapt and mitigate, with the additional language you see here. Finally, as the name suggests, policies and actions are at the core of the Regional Parks and Trails Policy Plan. And again, 2 of them are directly connected to this work group. Those are the natural systems and climate resilience policies. For newer commissioners, the climate resilience policy is brand new and was developed during the most recent policy plan update. The natural systems policy was an existing policy that was reframed and updated. This policy was formerly known as the Siting and Acquisition Policy. We updated this policy based on feedback from this group, the Metropolitan Parks and Open Space Commission, along with the work group and others to more clearly communicate the focus of this important policy area, as well as to create a through line from regional goals to parks and trails policy. The 2050 Regional Parks and Trails Policy Plan includes 4 work plan items that are connected to this work, and those are the 4 you see here. Number 5 in that list is explore the establishment of a special features open space natural system subclassification. We'll be talking more about that in just a minute. Reconvene Climate and Natural Systems Work Group to discuss implementation steps for climate resilience policy and actions. These 2 are connected. We also have related topics that connect to culture work, including develop an inventory and guidelines for harvestable fruits, mushrooms, and other plants. And finally, develop learning opportunities for implementing agencies to explore indigenous land management practices and other related topics. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Kevin to share 2026 work group priorities.
Awesome, thank you, Colin. So as Colin kind of mentioned, he was kind of laying a lot of the groundwork for how this work group came to be and some of the guiding documents and goals and objectives that we are working on. So shifting over into the present, looking at the work group priorities, we did a little bit of light work planning in the beginning of the year with this agency council work group, and we had essentially used multiple different sources to kind of fine-tune what priorities we want to focus on for 2026. And that includes the 2050 policy plan, so that's the work plan, in addition to the policies and actions that Colin kind of went through a slide or 2 back. And then we also took in some agency feedback, so we reached out to them, saw what specific topics were pressing issues for their agencies, and kind of just had discussions to kind of identify and prioritize these specific items. So in the future priorities, our big focus for 2026 is to focus on the exploration of the open space subclassification. I'll kind of dive into that in further detail in the next slide, but some other items also include looking for potential coordinated research projects or opportunities between each of the different agencies related to natural systems or climate resilience. This is something that we had explored late last year by doing a bit of a research needs assessment and just identifying potential partnerships we could leverage with local institutions like the University of Minnesota's Resilient Communities Project or the University of St. Thomas, and just seeing where we can coordinate. So throughout the year, we might revisit this list of specific research topics from time to time and figure out next steps on that. Other future priorities also include just coordinating learning opportunities for these different agencies. So we actually recently had Kenny present to our work group about the climate trends within Minnesota to kind of just provide these different opportunities to share ideas and learn more about different strategies for natural systems protection and climate resiliency. And then lastly, another item that we've identified for this year is continuing to build out that climate policy in our policy plan. So right now the actions are fairly high level and we're still trying to determine how we can most effectively support our agency's efforts at the Met Council level. So diving into the open space subclassification, I just wanted to note that this was something that was identified in our policy plan, work plan. This idea had initially started out as a concept while we were going through the Imagine 2050 planning process, and this was essentially a result of a question that we had asked of how can we further support the agencies in natural systems protection throughout the region. And the way that they had kind of responded, or the feedback that they provided, was that the best strategy for a regional parks and trail system for ensuring climate resilience is just acquiring more land and ensuring that this is under permanent protection for parks and trails, not only just for recreation, but to especially conserve and protect different habitats and natural areas in our region. So that was kind of one of the things that they had mentioned, and another aspect of it is that to grow the system, some of the existing levers that we have been proven to be a little less flexible than they'd like to be. And that was something that they had kind of brought up, and it was mostly due to a lot of the times acquisitions would come up very quickly, they'd have a quick turnaround time, and in some instances they lose out on that opportunity to purchase the land for parks or trails and lose it to development. So that was ultimately the main concern. And then agencies had also kind of mentioned that there were some inconsistencies from agency to agency when it came to protecting the land for the land's sake. And in some instances, some agencies had mentioned that they were allowed to purchase areas for conservation lands, conservation areas, while others didn't necessarily have that flexibility. They had to kind of keep it within the bounds of a greenway, trail, or a park space. So that's where that background kind of came from. And diving into kind of the what of the open space subclassification, this would likely be something that's nested within the special features classification in our system plan. So something at the similar level of the cultural landscape that was recently added in the most recent policy plan update. And right now, we are still figuring out the exact shape or what form it would take, but the purpose of this open space would be to prioritize the protection of these natural areas and to try and connect all of these spaces throughout the region, and to primarily focus on this protection of land rather than emphasizing that recreational focus. So an example that we've often been looking at has been either wildlife corridors, thinking of our park reserve concept, but maybe without that 1,000 acre requirement, because some of these areas are a lot smaller. Another outside example is also looking at scientific and natural areas at the DNR state level as well. So right now we're kind of deep into the exploration of the subclassification, and I just wanted to reiterate that this still is an exploration, so this isn't a determination that we will move forward with adding this to our system plan, but rather we're just exploring our options, seeing what exists in our region before we make an official action. So this is kind of the proposed timeline that we have, and the intention is that this entire scoping and if we do move forward with it, the drafting of the language would be intended to be completed by 2027. And the reason for that is that we wanted to get the general criteria and language of this specific subclassification codified into our policy plan ahead of the system additions process so that the agencies could start conceptualizing potential units that they might want to add, and just so that they can kind of have an understanding of potential search areas or corridors in the future. So diving into this timeline, in 2026, right now we're in that March and April period where we're performing an environmental scan. That's essentially just looking at existing plans, system plans, natural resource management plans from both our agencies, but also looking at local governments, viewing other areas that operate within the Twin Cities region. So that's also looking at reports from the Trust for Public Land or the Minnesota Land Trust, just to see holistically what's out there when it comes to natural area protection. This environmental scan also includes informational interviews with staff from these different organizations, just to fully understand what's going on in the Twin Cities and if this subclassification is being redundant, if this truly does have a niche in our system. And after that environmental scan, we would ultimately move to creating a couple recommendations for the subclassification. We'd be engaging with council committees, so potentially the Community Development Committee, but also with our park implementing agencies in that work group to determine whether or not we have enough information to move forward and draft potential policy plan language or create this subclassification. So after that determination, the rest of it is dependent on that specific decision on whether or not we move forward with the subclassification, and the rest of the year would focus on that development of the criteria, the language, and also looking at a minor policy plan amendment to just add in some placeholder language for 2027 and future policy plan update. So now that I kind of described a lot of the information about the open space subclassification and just some of the stuff that the work group is working on, we wanted to shift over to some discussion. So some of these questions actually do connect to the previous presentation that Kenny had. We wanted to ensure that we're connecting some of these findings to future action. So we have some questions related to that presentation, but we also wanted to hear your thoughts on the open space subclassification and on our work group priorities for this upcoming year, just to see if you have any additional thoughts or ideas for any of these topics. Thank you.
Alright, thank you. So this is our general feedback, I guess. If anyone has anything specific. There are some prompt questions on the last one, or you can make up your own, so. Anybody? Yeah, I'll start.
Stay safe out there, Kenny.
Thanks,
Thank
Kenny.
you very
Thank
much.
you again. So I guess my main thought on this is like, obviously I think some degree of open space is within our purview because it's in our name.
Yeah.
But I also wonder how to identify which open space should be part of the regional park and open space system specifically, as opposed to other things. You talked about redundancies, and there are some other things that exist. Like this is a new classification to us, but open space is not a new classification generally. There are, most significantly, I would say, the wildlife management area and scientific and natural area classifications under the DNR. And then at least some of our implementing agencies also have stuff like this. I know in my neck of the woods, Anoka, Ramsey, and Washington County all have open space units that are not part of the regional park system. And so I would wonder, when someone comes to us and said, this land we're interested in having as open space. What about it says this fits better as part of the regional park system versus any of those other kinds of classifications? I think it somehow would need to tie in, like it's not just about having more open land, it's more open land that serves some purpose related to our other stuff. So some of that might be, especially probably equity related in terms of like we talked about, you know, the urban heat island, what we saw for shade cover, transpiration, things like that. There might be underserved areas, and that especially might be places where a more flexible thing fits, because there may be areas where it's like, oh, we can get this, you know, narrow little corridor that's like a couple blocks wide, if that, but going through these neighborhoods that does something for that wouldn't make sense as something else. Maybe it's that. Another piece to keep in mind is we've talked about our limited funding situation and where else can we get funds. One of the big things to keep in mind here is that there are significant funds available for undeveloped land for like wildlife and habitat purposes that come with strings attached of it being open to hunting. And I know we've had some things come to this group before from Anoka County and Washington County, where they said, hey, there's this willing seller for this, we're gonna split it and put this in a regional park and this as a something else, so that we can use money that requires hunting on this parcel. So both, that's part of a, does it fit with us, and how does it affect our budget? But there might also be room for discussion of, should we be thinking about changes to, I don't even know if it's in our policy or if it's just ordinances of all of our partners of, should this classification maybe have different rules than other things to open it up to more funding possibilities? Stuff like that. And you also talked about kind of detaching it from the recreation aspect more, and I don't know if that's quite the way I would word it, because I think the role that I see largely for the regional system is that we are the in-between that connects recreation to nature, where we have, you know, your more local parks are recreation in the sense of like, you're just doing a thing and it doesn't really matter where you're doing it. And then you have your more sort of like wilderness things where it's, the primary purpose is for it to be nature, and like, yeah, there's that, and it's just sort of, we're the, how do you have nature that's accessible to people? But it doesn't necessarily need to mean that there's paved trails and buildings and things like that. In particular, this could be something where maybe there's more unpaved trails that aren't even necessarily like, you know, your 10-foot wide mowed trail. Maybe it's a 18-inch wide maintained just hiking corridor. We don't do a lot of that in our system currently. The things where it's just like, it's on the map enough for, you can go walk this area and not get completely lost, probably. We have like, here's the, you're definitely like in a city park kind of setting thing and you know what's going on. And then there's parts of our reserve units where it may just be wild. Some of those have some things that go through, and there's some mountain bike trails, there's some hiking trails. We don't do a ton of it. Maybe that's some of what happens here. Like, here's our relatively low impact kind of development that's not at the level of all of our other stuff. A different set of standards, perhaps. Yeah, I guess basically the overall thing we'll be looking at, how is this different from other possibilities, both at state classifications and local ones, to specifically say this relates to what we've seen as the goals of the regional park system different from those. And some of that might be looking at, you know, what do the implementing agencies already operate and why did they do what they did with them, and go from there. Does that trigger any other thoughts?
Yeah, I think, hi everybody. I don't know, I feel like I have to keep reading this and understand what the what the intent is.
Yeah.
Because I think that there are some implications related to adjacency. I mean, there's something, like, for example, the science and natural areas, like, usually those are acquired because they're in a geography, right, and they connect it, but we're not gonna do anything to it, right? You know, like, it's like that defines the amount of work, they're not gonna do any more work to a science and natural area. Probably, typically, right, you know what I mean?
Not much.
Yeah, that's what I mean,
Yeah.
it's like, so I think like there's a very particular definition once you do that of what's gonna happen there. And so I think there's, like for me, I think it gets to those things, and I'm not sure exactly, like I would need an example. Because I think the way our systems, everybody's a little different in terms of, but I do think there's something specific, like I just keep thinking about adjacency. The other thing I think about is that they talk about unique natural, like could you imagine discovering a quaking bog in the middle of Bloomington, you know, and then all of a sudden, like, what are we gonna do, right? And I think, and I don't know, maybe, you know what I mean, it's like, that's what I'm also imagining, that there's some unique natural feature, that this is a remnant, and there's a desire to like hold on to this natural system. And you know, I'm kind of, so maybe I'm reading more into it, and I think the one thing that they say, like even just a simple idea is, what happens if we just, for example, release the acreage requirement, you know, from park reserve? Does that open up and start to solve, or is there a need for a brand new designation, or do we solve for that by doing some expansion inside the existing definitions we have? You know,
Something where it's like we still keep it stays 80% natural, but it could be a smaller thing.
yeah, exactly. You know, like I said, that's why I'm kind of getting at intent. I just have to really. And then the last thing I will say is that I do think there's something interesting related to like value to a community or something. So for example, like Trust for Public Land is doing things around playgrounds. Like there's a statewide, very big look at natural playgrounds themselves, and designing them in a way where they themselves become a tool that begins a progression in nature or something. You know, I mean, there's the ways of thinking about it. So I think there's something about people, you know, that a community, if there's something about a community's value of a place, and that there could be value for a regional park system to absorb, like, are they talking about stuff like that? And if not, there's somebody already doing it. I think that's the other thing, is someone else gonna do that, and just the geographic connection allows it to work. And you know, so I'm not, you know, anyway, that's my, what's the intent? You know, what is the you know, what's the net increased impact, particularly relative to the way that people are experiencing the systems? Is there something related that maybe that is important, but yeah, I continue to go, we need one more part of the document that gets more, you know, inaccessible to a community member who wants to read it, you know?
I suppose I should also call out, when we're comparing to other things that exist in the region, I'm remembering now that there are also several significant private sector open space things that are not operated by any of our implementing agencies. And we also want to look at those and how they relate. And it may be that some of this stuff would be, you know, hey, maybe approach some partner and help them do something too. Like I know in Washington County, there's a big thing with the Bellwin Conservancy. They have a significant tract, actually a couple of them, I think. There are some smaller ones, especially ones that are like a significant habitat. You know, when you talk about the bog, there might be some little thing by the Isaac Walton League, which don't show up on maps ever. You have to really be digging to know they even exist, but they're interesting. And then there was something in Anoka County that I don't even remember. I think it was just its own little nonprofit for that particular parcel of land that I don't remember. It's named after some woman, but it's near another thing. And the only way I ever discovered it was there is I was driving to something else entirely and saw the sign, like, what is that? So there also might be some opportunities just for, in terms of when we talk about our marketing and outreach and stuff, maybe ask those people, is it okay if we put this on a map? Some of them, they might say no because they wanna keep it relatively low impact, but some of them might be like, yeah, that'd be great. Cause a lot of them are just like open to hiking, not a whole lot else, but they're there. There are recreation opportunities in the region.
It's interesting because there is like an Isaac Walton owned property next to Bush Lake Beach.
Yeah.
And like people buy memberships to it and it's kind of weird. You can go and swim in the lake, but it is largely, I think, kind of a conservation space.
Well, and that's the other question about like, there's different ones where sometimes it's maybe you need to pay for a membership, some of them are open to the public. And a lot of that is a communication issue of how do you know which one's which? Same thing, I don't know if there's any in the metro, probably, but like up north for sure, the Nature Conservancy owns a bunch of land. And some of those are open to public use and some of them are not, depending on what their land management goals are for it. And then they're open to different uses, like some of them pets are allowed, some of them they're not, some hunting is allowed, some of them it's not. So there's a range of that kind of stuff too. So we would wanna make sure, if we are gonna tell people that they exist, it'd be real upfront about, these have different rules than our other stuff, and you need to know this. But, yeah. Anything else?
I won't throw this out as like a solid idea, but I really like the question around intent. I think that's something we're still trying to figure out. Some of the work that the park agencies have been doing is they've been kind of stepping back and looking at the landscapes of their, political unit, their county or whatever. And then they're looking at their adjacent ones and trying to understand connection, are there natural corridors, and is there any, so they're almost thinking about this as, and it's not just an administrative boundary, but an administrative boundary that has almost a natural system theme to it, where people can maybe participate in it and receive some benefits. I don't know if they can apply to the Sarah Sam's Outdoor Heritage Council, that the legacy funded one that has done great conservation work in the metro and across the state. So I think that's something we'll continue to think about, and we're gonna be doing expert interviews. And so we'll keep evolving this idea, but we'll come back to you to sort of give you an update. But that was a helpful, quick set of.
Yeah. I would imagine some of this might be appropriate for reclassification of some existing things that we in particular jammed into regional trails. There are several spots on regional trails where it's like, we're gonna make it wider on this bit because there's a cool natural spot here. And it's like, it's not really part of the trail. Like, we have some trails that have a bigger spot because we're gonna put, some bathrooms and a parking area, a trailhead, whatever there. But there's some where, like, along Highway 96 in Shoreview, there's a spot where it's just some of the marsh around the lake is protected by a little blurb. And then further west along Rice Creek in Anoka County out in Fridley, there's some extra nodes of here's some nice undeveloped space, let's throw it into the trail because that's all we had at the time. And those ones where it's like, it's immediately adjacent to something else, in particular trails. So that's how people would access it and what they might be doing with that space. Like, okay, I wanna go birding, but I'm gonna bike to get there. Maybe it's that kind of thing. Is it, something where it's a totally standalone further out, or is it the bits that connect to something else and just were awkward before? Those are some of the opportunities.
I'm just saying that those bump outs, I think, are what often makes the regional trail system unique. It's the sort of natural resource based experience that people really want when they're out, rather than just a ribbon of asphalt. So, but you're right, like there's overlapping.
Well, yeah, and like there's been a difference between, Dakota County's been pushing their greenway idea of make it 100 or 200 feet wide. But then we have some things where it's, well, it goes half a mile. At that point, it's a resource on the trail, but in terms of which plan it goes in, is it part of the trail or is it related to the trail?
Good question.
In the same way that, when we look at proposed trails, we say, what does it connect? And okay, it goes from this park to this park, and there's this school and this population center. This could just be it connects these nodes of interesting open spaces. Could be the same thing as having them in it. Anything else? All right, thank you.
Thank you.
And you don't get to go anywhere. Talking more about work planning for 2026. We have Colin and Emmett.
Yeah, I'm gonna call the audible here at 5:46 and just say we will do the shorter version of this presentation. Sticking with it's not the Bob Mueller rule, it's the Bob Mueller guideline, that's what Tony said. We can go over 2 hours, but it's best to sort of try to stick to that, so we will try. But we did wanna just update you, we have been doing a tremendous amount of planning, that's what we've been bringing to you over the last several years, and we just wanted to share a little bit about how we're starting to move those ideas that you laid out there into action. And so that's what we want to talk about right now. And then if you have any questions or insights or advice in terms of what's happening, what we are taking up, this might fit into your earlier question, David, about here's something I'd like to put on the table for the commission to discuss. That might be perfectly timed with this, or it may not, and we can cover it in reports. Well, Colin, you want to kick us off?
Let's do it. Okay. Hello again, commissioners. It's still me, Colin Kelly. Good to see you. So we've talked a little bit about work planning already, so there'll be a few of these projects or items that you'll be familiar with, but others you may not. But needless to say, our 4-year work plan that makes up Section 9 of our Regional Parks and Trails Policy Plan is very connected to the work planning that we have done recently, earlier this year, and makes up kind of the second part of this presentation. To Emmett's point, we'll focus largely on this first part, keep it a little bit higher level, and of course we can get into further detail if questions arise or if you have specific interest going forward. This is the part that connects directly to our policy plan. And rather than go through each of these items that you see before you here, I'll just highlight likely an individual or two within these sort of subcategories or themes. So in accountability and research, we will implement the 2025 or now the 2026 Regional Parks and Trails System Visitor Study. Council staff and Wilder Research are in the process of recruiting surveyors now. It's a very exciting time for this effort. In protection and restoration, as we discussed in the previous item, we're exploring the establishment of an open space classification. Sometimes I remove the subpart because I think that just adds additional confusion. It's a classification, if you will. This item also references the renewal of regionally significant ecological areas, or RSEA data sets, which was previously coordinated by the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources, DNR. The Met Council research staff will now be coordinating this effort. This data helps local communities as they develop their local comprehensive plans and can help regional park implementing agencies as they consider future regional parks, park reserves, regional trails, and special features via a system additions process, which we talked just a little bit about in the last item. Moving along here, we've got 6 work plan items within the themes of culture and trails. In culture, I'd like to highlight item number 10 here, which says that we'll develop a training program and learning opportunities for council and park agency staff to explore indigenous land management practices and other related topics. As an example, later this month, implementing agency and Metropolitan Council staff will be attending tribal state relations training. Council staff, including planning analyst Tracy Kinney, are in the process of establishing a cohort with agency staff to ensure that the lessons learned at the training are carried forward into future work. In trails, I'll quickly mention aspects of both items 11 and 12 here. Like the Agency Council Climate and Natural Systems Work Group, there is an active trail system coordination work group that has been meeting over the last several months. This work group has been led by Senior Trails Planner Zoe Mock, and an important focus lately has been on creating regional guidelines for e-bike use on regional trails. I won't go into much detail on this today, as we plan to bring you an information item on this topic next month in April. Last but certainly not least, of course, finance-related topics. As you might expect, funding is often at the top of the list of topics to talk about and on people's minds. Here I'd like to highlight something that is still to come. This year, number 17 in our work plan references continuing the discussion of strategic funding for the regional parks and trail system. So like the work groups I've already mentioned, an implementing agency, Met Council work group, will reconvene to take on priority finance related topics, likely later this year. Yeah, I think that's about all I need to say on that topic right now. I am just gonna give you a quick, really quick look at what we had on the next few slides. Some of our teams got together for a retreat early this year to kind of go through the very specific tasks and projects that we'll take up this year. We've organized it just a little bit differently than how you saw the last part, kind of focused on either department management, so that is all of our work, or individual teams, including the Ambassador and Art and Policy Program, finance and planning, and then last but certainly not least, research. And again, the visitor study this year is a really important and heavy lift for the council and our consultant and many folks at within regional parks implementing agencies. So that will be a key focus of the year ahead. But I just flew through that last part because we do want to be respectful of the time. We'd be glad to talk a little bit about these topics today, but would certainly be glad to take these up again in the future as well. Emmett, is there anything you want to add here before we kind of move into just this quick opportunity for questions and discussion?
Yeah, no, thanks, Colin. This is, we are moving into implementation. We want you to know that. We're really working in all these areas around culture, finance, trail system coordination, climate and natural systems. It's there's a lot going on. But do you have any reflections on what you heard today, or questions about, well, when are you gonna take up this or that? So I'll stop there and just open it up.
Okay.
Well, I was gonna save this for I guess the end, but it just strikes me that like this is all very high level. But there's a specific item that I just think that has been in the news regularly in the last number of months that I think somehow we need to figure out if it doesn't fit in here, maybe there's a special look at it or whatever, but I'd like to dive and have a little more information on the impact of hyperscale data centers. Because I think what gets in the news is the electricity that it uses, and what maybe isn't reported on as much is the water that they're gonna be consuming. And what's going on right now with Pine Island and some of the other sites that are just these enormous construction things, and whether you're pro or not, it doesn't make any difference. The fact is they're gonna use a ton of water. And that is bound to have an impact on the surrounding environment, some of the park systems, there's just some implications. And the reason why I'm bringing it up now is we had a speaker come in to my church on Sunday, and he's one of those environmental lawyers that, he was explaining why they have to file lawsuits to try to slow things down so that they can study and have some time to deal with this. I just think that, I think frankly, the Metropolitan Council itself needs to have a little bit more on the front burner in terms of what the response is for the larger metro area in response to this. So somehow that needs to be looked at.
David, thanks, and I invited Lisa up just because she is the jack of all trades. She was the former land use planning, or local planning assistance manager, but also is helping us as a council coordinate on this very topic, so.
Thanks. I'm Lisa Barajas, Executive Director of Community Development. This actually is a topic that we have been seeing as some of those projects have had proposals go through environmental review process. The council already is a required commenter in that process. And as the environmental review issues aside, in the lack of helpful data that's being provided or not being provided in that process, in collaboration with our partners in environmental services, we have been reviewing what those impacts to overall management of growth and development in the region would look like, given the volume of water that some of these proposed data centers have proposed to use on their sort of upper ends of the scale or even moderate ends of the scale, which in some cases are within the context of some of the cities that they're being proposed within, would be enough water for more than 2 or 3 times the amount of projected household growth we have for that particular community over the 20-year planning horizon we have. That also means that water needs to go somewhere once they've used it, which usually is into our wastewater treatment system. So our environmental services partners have undertaken some studies that we are in the process of working through right now. We'll be bringing back to our council later this spring about what data centers would mean for impacts on water supply and water supply issues that we have already known within this region, as well as on our wastewater system itself, and then rolling that up, what that means then for, if this happens, then what do we do about managing growth? If we've put regional investments in place to support household growth, not for that to be usurped here, and if it does get taken here, then we have to plan for additional investment to support that growth, either here or elsewhere. And so there's significant cost implications to the entire region for that as well. So definitely top of mind for us. I'm happy to share with Emmett and Sandy to share back out with you all our conversation that we had with our council earlier this year. 2025, not in 2026. So it was just this last fall where we teed up that broader conversation for them, as well as talked about those next steps that we'd be bringing back to them later this spring as our studies conclude. But happy to share that with you, but absolutely top of mind for us.
I mean, would it be possible that it's mind-blowing, that the scale of what's happening and how quickly they're built and how resources are just tapped like that. I think it would be beneficial for us to just kind of hear some of that information and have a discussion somewhere along the line. So maybe it's a future meeting or something. And maybe we even have, some additional, some of the data that's already been collected, or maybe there's a speaker, whatever. I just think that we could have a little bit more on it. That'd be great.
Well, in particular, there's a little more nuance to it as it relates to our parks and trails stuff than what usually gets looked at. Because obviously there's the drinking water for humans and wastewater treatment issues are usually what we really talk about. In the context of parks, I'd want to know, are they planning on drawing from aquifers or surface water? Because aquifers are a huge deal for drinking water. That's where my drinking water comes from. But for the actual park, mostly they don't care. They're impacted by surface water more directly. So are we pulling out of that? And then how is it being used? There's some of them where it's kind of used internally and then discharged. There's others where they're cooling by evaporation. So is it, and if they, pull from an aquifer and then discharge into council wastewater treatment, it eventually ends up in surface water instead, so that would be an increase in surface water going somewhere downstream. Whereas if it goes into the sky, we're decreasing both but increasing humidity, like Kenny was talking about. So a little more of the nuance of how does this actually impact the parks, both from a natural system standpoint and also the recreational, like, okay, if it's just more humid over here, potentially a microclimate locally in this spot, what does that look like? Because that doesn't get any news attention, those kinds of things. Also, potentially finding out what the impacts might be on like wildlife and their patterns of movement. Are they bothered by certain vibrations or the warmth or humidity or whatever? And is that big enough to matter? Like some will just go around, but I know there's some things where we talk about having skyscrapers messing up bird patterns a lot, just both from the glass and from light. So is there anything significant like that we would want to care about, and then maybe comment on design standards to make it less disruptive or anything like that? But yeah, certainly an area, the conversation I just had with somebody recently, they're saying like all these things are happening and like they aren't getting any review. Like, well, that's not true. They're getting review by a local, like municipal level unit of government, and that has historically been fine because that's where zoning happens. If it's just a building, that's just a building. But when these ones are talking about aquifer impacts and things that go beyond the borders of a town.
They're just not,
So it's like,
these municipalities are not equipped.
exactly, like
Scalable.
the impact of it now goes bigger, so we have to bring it to a different level of government, and it makes sense for the Met Council to be that. Catching law up to that is a whole nother thing, but yeah. But specifically hearing like, well, how does this fit into the parks context for us would be useful.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'll connect with our team members. At this point, at least from the types of projects that we've seen so far in this region, they're primarily drawing from public water supply, which obviously for the most part in most of these areas is aquifer driven. That has other impacts. Our staff have put together a really great accessible way of understanding those impacts and what that means, and walk through kind of the different trade-offs of different ways of those water sources being used, as well as the different ways that cooling is being looked at as well. We haven't identified any specific impacts to the regional parks and trail system, but it's partly probably due to the proposed locations that we've seen so far in our reviews. But if you were to place them in different locations, they obviously would have different impacts. So part of that is just going to be more of a geographic proximity issue that the uses or the impacts are not as widespread as one would think unless you start to congregate them or they start to be a concentration of a number of different data centers in a particular area.
And I would imagine this part is probably already addressed by the comprehensive plan compliance issues. But like, are any of these lands being acquired for these things conflicting with potential search areas or search corridors for anything? Do we need to try to make sure to reserve something before sales go through?
Yeah, that's certainly what we do catch in an environmental review. Most of these are going to be, nearly all of them actually will require environmental review just because of the significance of the water use that they're proposing and the size of the buildings that they're proposing. And so that's where folks on Emmett's team, Colin does a lot of this work, are looking at those, how close is this? Do we have a corridor in this area? Those are the types of things that we're looking for when we're looking at proposed development. But I'm happy to share that presentation that we had with our council members, the conversation we had with them. It is a long one because it has a lot in it, so maybe you want to listen to it while you're making dinner or something like that. But we do go through a lot of the items that you've both highlighted today around what we're seeing, what some of those larger levers are that we may have available to us as a council, and some of the larger concerns that we have identified as staff, especially given the number of different proposals we had seen just in the South Metro alone. So having that concentration effect that we're most concerned about.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anything else? I guess one that I'll point out is, we've talked about legislative coordination. Most of the work there is asking for money, but I know we've had some things that are different than that in terms of policy. I know Bob had been asking for a while about whether we can tweak open meeting law to potentially have remote options. So I guess be thinking about, were there any other things like that that are not financial that we wanna try to bring up again?
One, I'll just mention that Dakota County has brought forward the last 2 sessions is the desire to ensure that park fines aren't misdemeanors, that they're administrative fines. Ramsey County did that recently, but the change they made didn't help Dakota County, so Dakota County is looking to actively do that and make this change in law. And I think that the other counties aren't coming on board because I think they don't believe that they think they have the authority already to make park violations be administrative fines.
That was my impression, but I thought there was already a statutory change that went through to give them the authority to do that, and that's what happened right before Ramsey County did.
Yeah, but it was I think tied to some weird geography that didn't cover the entire metro area, so.
For the county,
Yeah,
there's specific parts of statute.
Called out,
Only
yeah.
Ramsey County, only Dakota County.
so
Yeah.
it
Okay.
wasn't ideal. Yeah, but we're trying to
Okay.
fix that, which is a good thing, because we don't want someone who gets a misdemeanor for walking on a cross-country ski trail. While that is a serious violation, we don't want them to lose access to housing or something.
So the other thing to watch there is if it names specific counties, make sure that the amendment doesn't just say counties, because we have Three Rivers and Bloomington and Minneapolis Park Board and St. Paul. So if we just say, yeah, any county can do it, almost half of our agencies will be like, but I'm not a county.
Yeah.
So, okay. I thought that was taken care of, apparently I was wrong. That's good.
We're close.
Remind me of what the green stars mean.
Like the first part of the presentation where I just highlighted an individual topic, it was just me wanting to call out some things that were happening either now or this year. Things
Okay,
I wanted to call
so
some attention to.
those are starred on your presentation, they aren't like that in our plan.
No,
Okay.
and in fact, the second part of the presentation is really the work plan or draft work plan for our team and its
Okay.
work in this year ahead.
I just knew we put icons on some stuff in the plan, I couldn't remember if this
I
meant
appreciate you
anything.
bringing that up. I meant to provide just a little bit of orientation to that, but we kind of glossed over that
Sorry.
second part.
That was me.
There's some bold highlights in that second part too, and those reflect items that were presented to the Community Development Committee over its last 2 meetings, where some items were highlighted that were ongoing work or special projects that were to be taken up this year.
So I guess then probably the bulk of this would be stare at this a bit and ponder and maybe get back to you, staff, if you think of anything that we wanna do specifically.
We'll be coming forward with a lot of these items
Yeah.
as we move into the year. This is the work.
If there's anything that you want to be first, speak up.
Yeah, speak up. David, thanks for throwing that.
Yeah, yeah,
Okay, thank you.
yeah, thank you.
All right, I think with that, we can move on to our reports. First, I'm gonna steal Emmett's thunder, I'm sure, and mention that it does look like our District F vacancy is posted. So anybody watching who's interested in serving on the commission in the northeast-ish metro, we have an open seat. Let us know and you can apply on the Secretary of State website. It's under the open appointments, boards and commissions information. Next, we just wanna ask about people's availability. Maybe what I wanna do this by follow-up email because we only have half of us here. But our normal schedule would put us having a meeting on July 2nd. And the 4th of July falls on a Saturday, so the observed holiday is Friday the 3rd. So our meeting would be the evening immediately before an observed holiday. So the question would be, is that fine, or do we need to shift that to anything else?
Why we care is that we have to get operations and maintenance money through by July 15th, which is a legislative deadline, so we need a July meeting.
Yeah, we can't cancel it. Has
Okay,
to
so how about
happen
the
some-
week after it?
So, and
No, it won't work because of, we have to bring it to the full council.
it needs to be like
Oh, so you
Wait,
move
So it
it
needs
up.
to be earlier, yeah.
either earlier or
Can
maybe
you do
like
the
the
second?
beginning of the next week, yeah.
Yes.
Chris?
I won't be here for
Okay.
the second, but I'll do on the other side if I can, you know.
Could you do it earlier in late June?
Yeah.
I know that's weird to have our July meeting in June.
I would imagine we probably need to send
Send it out.
a poll by email.
Yeah.
Thanks
But
a lot.
start thinking about that.
Okay, that's good to know.
Yeah.
So okay, maybe we'll offer Sandy the July 2nd date and then you and I. can talk.
Yeah, cause that way you can offer only the dates that are actually possible instead of asking us, what date do you want? They'll be like, no.
I'll give a couple dates and we'll see
Thank you
what
very
works for
much.
folks.
I think that's all I have. Any other commission members? Hearing none. Wendy's not here. Staff.
I want to start with our exciting new hire. Selena Blanco Ramirez has been hired to replace Janessa Carlisle.
Hiding over here.
Yeah.
You can't see me.
But Selena's a member of our Parks Ambassador team, and we're really excited she's here. And so she'll be back and she'll be presenting at some point in the future, but really excited that you're here.
Welcome.
Thank you. Nice to meet you all.
Got to sit here for 2 hours just for that.
Legislative session, the chair presented our $1 million governor ask that would be matched by the council with $667,000. But the agencies have also put forward a $20 million bill, a little more exciting. It has bill numbers, they're actually the same numbers as last year because this is the second year of the same session. We need to ask whether the council could match it, but we would certainly try that. Our chair, Robin Hutchison is interested in coming and visiting the Parks and Open Space Commission at our next meeting, so we were gonna she's gonna drop in on the early side. Lisa has told me that we will accommodate her when she's able to be here, so that's good. But she's really interested in parks and trails, and she has a real passion, so I think it would be good for you folks to get to know her. I'm excited the Trail System Coordination is gonna come to this group. Anthony, thank you for your help on that work group also, because it's really important work, but it's really front edge work that's happening here, and it's really reflective of some of the great work that's going on in our regional park implementing agencies, so.
Zoe's doing a really good job, and really driving the group and herding the cats and, prodding the shit, yeah, it's a lot going on there.
It's a lot of thankless work and also good work, so thank you, thank you both. That's it.
That's it. All right, then we're ready to adjourn. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.